Hi there, welcome. I'm Tom. This is Tom's Grinder Lab. This little video is on the what, the why, the how of seasoning your new grinder's coffee burrs. You get your new grinder, it's nice and shiny, and you think, can I just make an espresso straight off the bat? Or do I have to put a couple of kilograms, a few pounds of supermarket beans through it first? So we're going to unpack all of that. We'll start with the what is burr seasoning. We'll go into the why, details on that, and we'll go into the how, and we'll go into the Grinder Lab, and I'll show you how I season burrs. So let's kick off with the what. First of all, burr seasoning is when you season burrs, you grind a large quantity of roasted coffee through a new set of grinder burrs, typically 2 to 3 kilos. Some burr sets need more seasoning than others. Some grinders become more predictable and more consistent after seasoning. And with seasoning, grounds become uniform, but also larger and coarser, which explains why when you're seasoning a new grinder, sometimes to get the perfect espresso shot, you find you're having to grind finer and finer and finer. So that's bit of a context as to what burr seasoning is. Why would you want to do it? The sharp edge of a new burr's teeth, is what I call them, flute some people call them, are often not uniform. So by the sharp edges, we're referring to these ridges here, and obviously on each burr set. And down here on a conical burr, there's obviously flat burrs, and you'll see more ridges here. So those teeth, when you put them under a microscope, have little tiny inconsistencies with them, and surprisingly to me at least, even though they're a steel burr, just the act of putting 5 pound, a couple of kilos of coffee beans through them, smooth those edges out, which I have to say is a little surprising to me, because you'd think something as hard as stainless steel that's been specifically hardened in the engineering process would be very uniform. But what's more surprising to me is that 5 pound or a couple of kilos of coffee beans will actually smooth out those edges, something that the engineering process didn't do. But that apparently is the reality of the situation. So less uniform edges may produce less uniform grounds, producing inconsistent flavor and unbalanced flavor and weaker flavor and chasing the dial and needing to grind progressively finer. Let's unpack that a little bit. So we've got these edges on the cutting part of the burr, and they're not perfectly even. You put a couple of kilos or a few pounds of coffee beans through them, and that makes them more uniform on the edges. Now, when you have edges that are not cutting the same consistently right across the burr, that's when you end up with inconsistent flavor. So one shot you might think is lovely, the next shot might be unbalanced. And by unbalanced, I mean very often there's too much sour or too much bitter in them, or it could be both in the same cup, which is very unpleasant. That's a sinker, you pour that one down the sink. Also, as I've noticed, and this is anecdotal, just could be unconscious bias, but I've noticed that when a burr is seasoned properly, I experience a fuller flavor. So let me just unpack chasing the dial a little bit. So what happens here is that you've got a new grinder and it's not seasoned, and you might get, let's say you get a perfect espresso pour at say 10 on the dial. And you think that was lovely, I'll do another grind at the same dial setting, and suddenly it's a gusher. So you think, wow, I don't know why, but suddenly it's not grinding fine enough. So you put the dial from 10 to 5, and it's even worse. So you put it down to 1, and it chokes it. You think, well, I've gone too far. So you put it back to 5, and it's still choking it. And you put it back to 10, and it's a gusher again. And this can drive you absolutely nuts. It's what I call chasing the dial. It's where a movement in the dial doesn't produce a predictable change in the flow rate. So you might put the dial finer, but the flow rate's faster, as if you'd put it coarser. And this disappears after seasoning. Now, some grinders will do this. Malvani Livy is one that would do it. That had the Mazda, I put Mazda 83 conical burrs in it, big conical burrs. Some grinders, like, let's say the Niche Duo or the Niche Zero, don't do it at all. And I don't know why, but some do and some don't. But that's one of the things that can drive you nuts. And that disappears, or disappeared in the Livy once I had 2 kilos through it, which. So do you have to season the burrs? No, you don't. But you do be aware that as you season the burrs, the flavor will become fuller. It will typically become more balanced, and therefore the espresso, I think, for most of us is going to be more enjoyable. But you don't have to. And as I said, there are some grinders where there's no chasing the dial right from the get-go. You put 20 grams through just to clean it out, and it's all good. So let's look at the how, and I'll show you physically how I do seasoning with a new grinder. And we'll also have a look at how much you should put through a new grinder. Here we are in the grinder lab. See, I've got a couple of big bags of supermarket beans there. These are 1 kilogram bags. So It's a total of, let's say, Imperial 4.4 pound, I think. I have a big plastic container. I have a little lid to act as a kind of a step to make sure the top container is sitting level on the base of the grinder, and then I'm going to open it up to a medium setting. Not too fine, not too coarse, just somewhere in the middle of your dial will be fine. You see I put the coffee beans into some containers, and I'm just going to tip them into the top of the grinder and let it do its thing, making sure I'm keeping the grounds distributed evenly in the plastic container so I don't have a mess on the bench. Now, you see in the background on the right-hand side, there's a big table outside. That's actually where I normally do my grinding, but it was kind of windy today, so I did it inside at the risk of a divorce. It can get really messy, which is why I do it outside. And you'll notice that every now and then I put my hand on the grinder just to see if it's getting warm or not. If it is getting warm, you need to give it a break. So what I do is I get a little timer and I set it for 5 minutes. If it's starting to feel warm, I'm going to give it a break. With a big grinder like this, a grunty motor, it's really a light commercial motor. This is the Varia VS6. I could probably put a kilo through there before I need to give it a rest. But if I have a little Varia VS3, then I'm probably only going to grind about 60 grams before I give it a 5-minute rest. So it's very motor size dependent and power dependent. So with this grinder, I'm a little lazy. I probably should have put 3 kg through it, but I put 2 kg through, and it probably took, I guess, half an hour or so. I only had one break of 5 minutes. And what you do with the grounds is you don't throw them in the rubbish. You can actually recycle. There are some recycle centers around, very few and far between. But what I do is I recycle it. Is Floki, my dog, having a bone? Don't worry, buddy, I'm not going to throw it over you. So find a pot plant. There's my beehive, one of the beehives there. And you're just going to throw the grounds into the garden. Some plants love this, some plants don't. So for goodness sake, do a Google search. And then clean up. I prefer to use a vacuum rather than a blower because I don't want grinds going to all sorts of inconvenient places inside the grinder. And that's pretty much it. Job done. So that's how to do your seasoning. And the next question is, well, how much? And I base my recommendations on the law of diminishing return, which this little curve here represents. So this might be 1 kilogram, and perhaps you're 10% of the way to fully seasoning the Burrs. This could be 2 kilograms. But so with 2 kilograms, you might be able to get 2/3 of the way there, and you might need another 12 or 14 kilograms to get fully seasoned, which in my view is probably not worth it. So how much should you use in seasoning Burrs? It's going to be Burr dependent, and even Burrs of the same size will vary greatly. So take these as general guidelines. This is obviously going to vary depending on the Burr size, and not just the Burr size, but you can have 2 Burrs, say 60 fill mill flat Burrs. You can have 2 Burrs which will require more seasoning, one versus the other, depending on the steel they're made of and how hardened they are and so on. So take these as general rules, but I think they're pretty good indicator of what was going to get you most of the way to fully seasoned with kind of maximum result for minimum effort, bang for bucks if you like. So for 64 mil Burrs and smaller, conical or flat, doesn't really matter too much. The general rule of thumb is that 2 kilograms is going to get you 2/3 of the way to full seasoning. If you want to get closer to full seasoning, you're going to need to more than double. So 5 kilograms is going to have to go through it. You can add half as much again if your Burrs are coated. So if you have SSP Red Speed or something like that, Silver Knight and so on, then you want to put another 50% on for coated Burrs. So with an 80 mil Burr and larger, then you're probably going to need to get 5 kilograms through the Burrs in order to get to 68% fully seasoned. Now that's a heck of a lot, and I'm probably not inclined to do that, but this is what the research is telling us, and I'll give you links to that research below the video. 20 kilogram gets you closer to 100%. I cannot imagine putting 20 kilograms of beans through a grinder, sitting there and doing that. That's going to take you a day or 2 days to do. So absolutely the same with coated Burrs though. If you've got a Burr that's coated with Red Speed or Silver Knight or whatever, then you're going to have to put 50% more than this through. So if you've got a hand grinder, life's too short. Just put 40 or 200 grams through, depending on how enthusiastic you are feeling at the time. Most hand grinders tend to be small conical Burrs. They do take less seasoning, fortunately, but I tend to get a little bit lazy, and the most I think I've ever put through a hand grinder, not a benchtop one, but a handheld grinder, would be 200 grams. A lot of them I'm putting 50, 60, 80 grams through. So where am I getting these numbers from? I'm getting a lot of them from guesswork and just seeing what happens when unpredictability has gone out of a grinder and how many kilos I had to grind to do that. How many kilos it took to get a full flavored espresso out of a new set of Burrs, etc. But I also had a deep dive and got someone who's far more technical than I am to interpret the results from some excellent research done by Mark Al-Shameri. and the tests, his tests are below. So I've interpreted his test results, hopefully, and I've balanced them up with my own experience. But I'm really confident that the minimum recommendations here of 2 kilograms for 64 mil burrs, 3 kilograms if they're coated, 5 kilograms for 80 mil and larger burrs is going to get you a long way towards being fully seasoned and having a great espresso in the cup and not having to chase the dial without having to do the extreme of, say 20 kilograms of beans. So a big shout out and thank you to Mark El-Shameri for that. And as I said, the link will be at the bottom here. So if you got value from this, please subscribe. That's my reward as you subscribe. Make sure you also go to Tom's Grinder Lab and download the free guide that I have on troubleshooting and optimization for espresso. That's it for me. Thanks for listening, and make sure you subscribe, click the like button, and what the hell, why don't you share? Cheers.